The Northwood High School parking lot in suburban Chester County, Pennsylvania, lay quiet under the deepening twilight on Tuesday, November 14th, awaiting the arrival of a pickup truck that would shatter its peace. The late autumn air held a crisp chill, and the overhead fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, cold shadows across the empty spaces. Only a handful of cars remained scattered near the building entrances, remnants of after-school activities or teachers working late. The ordinary quiet of a suburban school evening was about to be violently interrupted. Just before 6:30 p.m., a vehicle entered the lot. It was a dark-colored Ford F-150 pickup truck, registered to Thomas G. Harding, a resident of a quiet neighborhood less than 10 miles away. The truck idled for a moment near the far end of the lot, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Then it moved slowly, deliberately, towards a cluster of parked cars near the gymnasium entrance. The engine cut out. Silence returned, thick and expectant. Moments later, the silence broke. Sharp, distinct cracks echoed across the asphalt. Pop, pop, pop. Then a pause. Pop, pop, followed by another pause. Pop. 7 shots in total according to later forensic analysis. The sound, unnatural and jarring against the suburban backdrop, drew no immediate attention. The school building was mostly empty. Passing traffic on the nearby road was oblivious. It was nearly 7 o'clock when a school custodian, finishing his shift, walked towards his car parked on the edge of the lot. He noticed 2 vehicles parked close together. Not unusual, but the angle seemed odd. As he approached, his eyes registered something on the ground, near the driver's side of a small sedan. It was a person, lying still. A sudden cold dread seized him. He moved closer, cautiously. Then he saw the second person, slumped against the passenger door. The custodian retreated, his heart pounding, fumbling for his phone to call 911. The call was logged at 7:03 p.m. Chester County law enforcement officers were dispatched immediately. The scene was grim upon arrival. A young woman lay deceased on the asphalt, next to a dark-colored Honda Civic. Inside the car, a man was slumped, also clearly deceased, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. The car's windows were intact, but bullet holes were evident in the body panels and driver's side door. Shell casings, later identified as .45 caliber, were scattered on the ground nearby. The responding officers secured the perimeter, stretching bright yellow crime tape around the area. The sterile glow of police cruiser lights mixed with the indifferent hum of the school's fluorescents. Crime scene investigators were called to the scene. They worked methodically under the cold lights, photographing, measuring, collecting evidence. Every detail was crucial: the position of the bodies, the trajectory of the bullets, the location of the shell casings, the contents of the vehicles. The cold precision of the forensic process began, a stark contrast to the violent chaos that had just unfolded. Identification of the victims proceeded quickly. The young woman was identified as Sarah Harding, an 18-year-old senior at Northwood High School. The man was identified as James Ellis, a 37-year-old history teacher at the same school. The connection was immediately apparent: student and teacher. This relationship, seemingly innocent to the casual observer, would quickly emerge as the central devastating motive behind the violence. Sarah Harding was a vibrant, intelligent student, well-liked by her peers and teachers. She was involved in extracurricular activities and was preparing for college applications. Her life, full of promise, ended abruptly on the cold asphalt. James Ellis was a long-tenured and respected member of the Northwood faculty. He was known for his dedication to teaching and his quiet professional demeanor. Neither had any known enemies that would explain such a brutal act of violence. As investigators processed the scene, they noted the dark Ford F-150 pickup truck parked nearby, belonging to Thomas Harding, Sarah's father. It was still running when officers arrived, the keys in the ignition. This detail immediately elevated Thomas Harding to a person of significant interest. His truck, his daughter, her teacher, all in the same parking lot under such horrific circumstances. The pattern began to form, chilling and clear. Initial interviews with school staff and students who were still in the building, or leaving around the time of the shooting, offered little direct information about the event itself. No one reported seeing the shooting occur. A few mentioned hearing what they thought were fireworks or a car backfire. The quiet normalcy had effectively masked the horror from immediate public view. The stillness of the scene, captured in the early crime scene photos, was a haunting testament to the sudden, isolated nature of the attack. Investigators also began the difficult task of notifying the victims' families. Thomas Harding, located shortly after his truck was identified at the scene, was found at his nearby home. He was taken into custody for questioning. His demeanor was described as quiet, reserved, and cooperative, offering no immediate resistance. His wife, Sarah's mother, was notified separately, and the immediate devastation and shock were profound. As the night wore on, the scene remained active. Forensic technicians meticulously documented every aspect of the area surrounding Sarah's Honda Civic and the Ford pickup. They collected fibers, fingerprints, and other trace evidence. The vehicles themselves would be transported to a secure facility for more thorough examination. The .45 caliber shell casings were bagged and tagged, a crucial piece of evidence linking a specific weapon to the scene. The cold, hard facts of the physical evidence began to lay the foundation for the narrative of the crime. The quiet parking lot, now a scene of intense police activity, held the first answers. The question that immediately arose was simple yet terrifying. Why? Sarah Harding's life was rooted in the suburban landscape of Chester County. She grew up in a comfortable, tree-lined neighborhood, attended local schools, and was a familiar face in the community. Described by friends as bright, funny, and ambitious, she was actively involved in the school yearbook committee and volunteered at a local animal shelter. Her academic performance was strong, and she had aspirations of attending a university out of state, pursuing a degree in journalism. Her social media presence painted a picture of a typical American teenager: photos with friends, school events, family vacations. There was no outward indication of any turmoil or hidden struggles that would foreshadow such a tragic end. Her bedroom, later examined by investigators, was neat and orderly, filled with typical teenage possessions: posters, books, a desk covered in school papers. It was the room of a young woman looking forward to her future, a future brutally stolen. James Ellis had been a history teacher at Northwood High for 12 years. He taught American history and government. He was known for his engaging lectures and his willingness to stay after class to help students. Colleagues described him as professional, somewhat private, but dedicated to his work. He lived alone in a modest house in a nearby town. Records showed he had no prior criminal history. He was a quiet member of the community, his life seemingly revolving around his profession. His classroom at Northwood High, a place of learning and routine, would become a focus for investigators seeking to understand the nature of his relationship with Sarah Harding. Desks in neat rows, historical maps on the walls, a worn copy of the Constitution on his desk. The setting felt profoundly disconnected from the violence that had occurred just outside the school doors. The initial police investigation focused on establishing a timeline and identifying potential motives. The presence of Thomas Harding's truck at the scene, combined with Sarah's identity, immediately pointed towards a potential domestic issue. Though the involvement of her teacher complicated this, investigators began interviewing Sarah's friends, family members, and school staff. They sought to understand Sarah's relationships, her state of mind, and any conflicts she might have been experiencing. Simultaneously, they delved into James Ellis's background, seeking any information about his personal life, relationships with students, or any potential enemies. Early interviews with Sarah's close friends began to reveal whispers, discreet mentions of a relationship Sarah was involved in that she was keeping secret. Not a typical teenage romance, but something more complicated. The subject of these whispers, friends were hesitant to say, was often referred to only vaguely. One friend tearfully recounted Sarah confiding in her about someone older, someone she cared about deeply, but knew the relationship was wrong and potentially dangerous. The friend did not initially name James Ellis, fearing repercussions or simply unable to process the reality. Meanwhile, investigators were processing Thomas Harding. He remained cooperative, but offered little concrete information regarding the events in the parking lot. He stated he had gone to the school that evening, though his stated purpose was vague. He did not admit to the shooting during these initial interviews. His demeanor was consistently quiet and withdrawn, a man seemingly in shock or deep distress. This emotional restraint, while potentially indicative of trauma, also raised questions for seasoned investigators. A father whose daughter had just been murdered, showing such minimal outward reaction, The forensic examination of the crime scene yielded critical initial findings. 7.45 caliber shell casings were recovered from the asphalt near where Sarah's body was found. The bullet trajectories indicated multiple shots fired at close range, both at Sarah outside the car and at James Ellis inside the vehicle. The dark Ford F-150 was examined. A .45 caliber handgun was found on the passenger seat. The weapon was secured as evidence. Its make and model were noted, and it was prepared for ballistics testing. The discovery of the likely murder weapon inside Thomas Harding's vehicle, parked just feet from the victims, dramatically escalated the investigation. This was no longer just a person of interest. He was now the prime suspect. The quiet suburban evening had been shattered not by a random act, but by something deeply personal and contained within the parking lot's confines. The chilling presence of the father, his daughter, and her teacher, now linked by violence and a handgun in a pickup truck, left little doubt about the devastating narrative that was unfolding. The precise details of how this devastating intersection came to be were still emerging. Thomas G. Harding was a man deeply embedded in the routines of suburban life. 52 years old, he worked as an accountant for a firm in a nearby town. Neighbors described him as quiet, dependable, a man who kept to himself but was always polite. He was known to be a devoted husband and father. He attended the local church regularly with his family. His life, from all outward appearances, was one of stability and normalcy. This public persona, meticulously constructed over decades, stood in stark contrast to the events of that Tuesday evening. His relationship with his daughter Sarah was perceived by others as typical for a father and teenage daughter. Friends of Sarah recalled her mentioning that her father could be strict, particularly about her academic performance and her friends. However, they also described moments of warmth and affection between them. Thomas Harding seemed to take pride in Sarah's achievements and her plans for the future. The idea that this quiet, seemingly ordinary man could be capable of such violence was met with widespread shock and disbelief in his community. As the investigation continued, details began to emerge about the dynamics within the Harding household leading up to November 14th. While the family presented a united front publicly, there were underlying tensions. Sarah, on the cusp of adulthood, was naturally seeking more independence, a process that sometimes clashed with her father's more traditional expectations. There were discussions, sometimes arguments, about her choices and her future. These were not perceived as unusual or overly problematic by those who knew the family, fitting within the normal friction of a parent-teenager relationship. However, in retrospect, these moments might have masked deeper currents. Simultaneously, investigators were piecing together the timeline of the shooting. Witness accounts from inside the school and nearby businesses were reviewed. Security camera footage from the school and surrounding areas was collected. While the school parking lot itself had limited camera coverage of the specific area where the shooting occurred, footage from the entrance and exits provided crucial timing information regarding the arrival and departure of vehicles, including Thomas Harding's truck and Sarah's Honda Civic. This digital trail began to corroborate the physical evidence found at the scene. The relationship between Sarah Harding and James Ellis became the central focus. While Sarah's friend had alluded to an older boyfriend, directly naming James Ellis proved more difficult initially. However, investigators began examining Sarah's phone and social media accounts, as well as James Ellis's digital footprint. This meticulous digital forensic work proved invaluable. Encrypted messaging apps, deleted texts, and carefully worded emails began to reveal the hidden nature of their relationship. They were not just student and teacher, they were romantically involved. The communications indicated a relationship that had been ongoing for several months, conducted in secret, often late at night through digital channels. The tone of the messages ranged from affectionate to anxious, reflecting the clandestine nature of their connection and the inherent risks involved. Investigators also learned that rumors about the relationship, or at least suspicions, had begun circulating within the school community in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Students gossiped, and some staff members had noted unusual interactions between Sarah and Mr. Ellis. However, these remained largely unsubstantiated rumors, not formally reported to school administration. This quiet undercurrent of suspicion provides context for the volatility that was building beneath the surface of the seemingly calm school environment.
The critical question remained: how and when did Thomas Harding discover this relationship? Was it a sudden, shocking revelation? Had he suspected something? The initial interviews with Thomas Harding offered no clear answer. He maintained his quiet, almost detached composure. However, the presence of his truck, the murder weapon inside it, and his daughter and her teacher deceased feet away made his denial untenable. The evidence was overwhelming. The focus shifted from identifying a suspect to understanding the sequence of events and the precise trigger for the violence. The quiet life of the accountant, the secret life of the student-teacher relationship, and the brutal reality of the parking lot shooting were converging. The exact moment these worlds collided, and the mechanism of that collision, was the next piece of the puzzle investigators had to find. The answer lay hidden in the hours and days leading up to that Tuesday evening, waiting to be uncovered through forensic detail and digital trails. The pivotal discovery that illuminated Thomas Harding's motivation came not from his direct confession, but from the meticulous examination of digital evidence and witness statements gathered in the days following the shooting. Investigators sifting through Sarah Harding's recovered phone data found a series of messages that painted a clearer picture of the events preceding her death. Crucially, they found an argument between Sarah and her father conducted via text message just days before the shooting. The context of this argument, though initially veiled, became clear when cross-referenced with other data. Sarah had been making plans to spend time with James Ellis, using a pretense of school-related activities to cover her tracks. Her father, Thomas, had become increasingly suspicious of her whereabouts and her explanations for needing to be out late or unavailable. The text exchange revealed his growing frustration and distrust. While the early messages were typical parent-teenager disputes about curfews and honesty, the tone escalated sharply. A key piece of digital evidence surfaced, a message Sarah sent to a friend on the morning of the shooting, expressing intense distress. She wrote that her father had discovered her relationship with Jay and that he was furious and had forbidden her from seeing him. She mentioned a confrontation that had occurred the previous evening, described as terrifying. This message, sent just hours before she died, provided a direct link between her father's knowledge and her state of fear. This digital trail was corroborated by an interview with Sarah's mother, who after the initial shock was able to provide more context about the days leading up to the tragedy. She confirmed that Thomas had been agitated and withdrawn in the days before the shooting. She recalled a heated argument between Thomas and Sarah 2 nights prior, though she had not understood the full extent of what it was about at the time. Thomas had confronted Sarah, likely presenting evidence he had gathered through means that remained initially unclear, perhaps checking her phone records, seeing a message alert, or overhearing a conversation. The mother confirmed Thomas had explicitly forbidden Sarah from seeing James Ellis again, and had expressed extreme disapproval of the relationship, stating it was morally wrong and illegal. The motive, once shrouded in speculation, was now starkly clear. Thomas Harding had discovered his daughter's sexual relationship with her high school teacher. The revelation had ignited a profound rage and sense of betrayal within him. His subsequent actions were not random, but appeared to be a direct, violent response to this discovery. Further forensic analysis also accelerated the timeline. The .45 caliber handgun found in Thomas Harding's truck was definitively matched through ballistics testing to the shell casings recovered at the scene, and the bullets removed from the victims' bodies. The legal firearm was registered to Thomas Harding. This irrefutable physical evidence solidified his connection to the murders. Additionally, traffic camera footage from intersections near both Thomas Harding's home and Northwood High School confirmed his vehicle's movements on the evening of November 14th. The footage showed the dark Ford F-150 leaving his neighborhood around 6:10 p.m. and arriving in the vicinity of the school just before 6:30 p.m., aligning perfectly with the estimated time of the shooting. There were no other vehicles matching that description entering or leaving the parking lot during the critical time frame. The combination of the digital evidence revealing Thomas Harding's discovery of the relationship and his subsequent fury, coupled with the definitive forensic link between his weapon and the crime, and the corroborating traffic camera footage, built an overwhelming case. Thomas Harding was no longer just a person of interest. He was the perpetrator. The motive was not complex. It was brutally simple and devastatingly human. a father's violent reaction to what he perceived as a profound transgression involving his child. The quiet facade of the accountant and devoted father had crumbled, revealing a capacity for lethal rage that had been hidden beneath the surface of his ordinary life. The precise mechanics of how he executed the act in the darkness of the parking lot were the subject of continued investigation, but the why had been answered. The rapid accumulation of this evidence marked a significant acceleration in the investigation, shifting focus from identifying the suspect to building the case for prosecution. With the why and the who established, investigators focused on reconstructing the final moments in the Northwood High School parking lot, leveraging forensic evidence, witness timing, and the digital trail. They pieced together a chilling sequence of events. Sarah Harding and James Ellis had arranged to meet in the parking lot after evening school activities had concluded. Their communications indicated this was a planned, albeit clandestine, meeting. Sarah's Honda Civic was parked in a secluded area of the lot, away from the main entrance, a location likely chosen for privacy. They arrived separately, as confirmed by security footage from different school entrances. It is believed Thomas Harding, fueled by his recent discovery and anger, had driven to the school specifically to intercept them. Whether he knew they would be there or if he waited, is not precisely clear from the evidence, but his timing was tragically precise. He arrived shortly after Sarah and James Ellis were in the Honda Civic. The forensic evidence suggests a rapid, brutal confrontation. The pattern of shell casings indicates Thomas Harding approached the driver's side of the Honda Civic. Sarah was likely standing outside the car, perhaps having just gotten out or preparing to leave. James Ellis was in the driver's seat. Multiple shots were fired. Ballistics analysis determined the sequence and trajectory of the bullets. Sarah was struck multiple times outside the vehicle. James Ellis was shot while inside. The close range and multiple wounds indicated a targeted, deliberate attack. The violence was swift and contained, erupting and concluding in a matter of moments. The presence of the .45 caliber handgun registered to Thomas Harding in his truck, parked feet away, solidified the timeline and his direct involvement. It appeared he had driven to the location armed, ready for a confrontation or worse. The state of his truck, found running with the keys in the ignition, suggested he may have intended to leave immediately after the shooting, or perhaps his state of mind was such that he was simply unaware of these details in the immediate aftermath. Further examination of Thomas Harding's digital devices revealed searches related to Northwood High School, its layout, and potentially class schedules in the days leading up to the shooting. This suggested a degree of planning, indicating his actions were not purely spontaneous but were the result of escalating rage and a deliberate decision to confront Sarah and James Ellis. The searches also hinted at how he might have confirmed the existence and nature of the relationship or planned the timing and location of the confrontation. Perhaps he monitored Sarah's phone or online activity, or perhaps he followed her. The exact method of his discovery remains somewhat ambiguous, but the certainty of his knowledge and its immediate violent consequence was undeniable. The nature of Sarah and James Ellis's relationship, as revealed through their communications, was complex and troubling. The messages showed signs of affection but also secrecy, guilt, and awareness of the wrongness of their connection. Sarah expressed fear of being discovered and the potential repercussions for both of them. James Ellis's messages sometimes reflected attempts to manage her anxiety while also continuing the relationship. The power imbalance inherent in a teacher-student relationship, particularly one involving an 18-year-old student who was still a minor under school policy and in the eyes of many added a layer of disturbing context to the motive. While not legally defined as statutory rape in Pennsylvania at age 18, such relationships are universally condemned by educational institutions and often viewed as predatory due to the inherent authority dynamic. This ethical and moral boundary violation, now known to Thomas Harding, appeared to have been the catalyst for his rage. The rapid accumulation of this evidence, the timeline reconstruction, the definitive ballistics match, the corroborating digital footprint, and the confirmation of the underlying relationship allowed prosecutors to quickly build a strong case against Thomas Harding. He was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest of the seemingly ordinary accountant sent ripples of shock through the quiet suburban community. The man everyone thought they knew was now accused of a horrific double homicide. The methodical process of the criminal justice system began, moving from the silent crime scene to the public forum of the courtroom. The details of the shooting, once confined to forensic reports, would now become the narrative presented to a judge and jury. The quiet devastation of the parking lot had escalated into a very public tragedy. The next phase would involve presenting the cold hard facts of the investigation in a legal setting where the human cost of the violence would be laid bare. Following his arrest and formal charging, Thomas Harding was held without bail. The initial legal proceedings were relatively swift. He appeared in court for his arraignment where the charges were formally read. His plea was entered as not guilty. He was assigned a public defender, a common procedure given the severity of the charges and his financial situation post-arrest. His legal team immediately began preparing for the complex and emotionally charged case. The community reaction was one of profound shock and grief. News of the murders, particularly the involvement of a teacher and a student, and the subsequent arrest of the student's father, dominated local news. Neighbors and colleagues of Thomas Harding expressed disbelief that the quiet, ordinary man they knew could be capable of such an act. The Northwood High School community was particularly affected. Counselors were made available to students and staff. Tributes to Sarah Harding and James Ellis appeared at the school, though the complex and controversial nature of their relationship added a layer of discomfort and conflicting emotions to the grieving process, particularly regarding James Ellis. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the forensic evidence and the digital trail. They would argue that Thomas Harding, upon discovering his daughter's relationship with James Ellis, had planned and carried out a premeditated attack. The registered firearm found in his truck, the matching ballistics, the traffic camera footage placing him at the scene at the time of the murders, and Sarah's messages detailing her father's fury provided a compelling narrative of motive and opportunity. The defense faced a significant challenge. While they could not dispute that Thomas Harding was present and that his weapon was used, they might explore arguments related to his state of mind. Potential defense strategies could include claiming provocation, temporary insanity, or a lesser charge like voluntary manslaughter based on extreme emotional disturbance upon discovering the relationship. They would need to present evidence or arguments that mitigated the premeditation aspect of the charges. This would likely involve delving into Thomas Harding's psychological state at the time of the shooting and the impact the discovery had on him. Meanwhile, the personal toll on the families of the victims was immense. Sarah Harding's mother, now facing the loss of her daughter and the imprisonment of her husband, was in an unimaginable situation. She was interviewed by investigators and later by the defense team, her testimony potentially crucial and deeply painful. The family of James Ellis also grappled with their grief, complicated by the revelations about his relationship with Sarah. The public nature of the trial meant that intensely private and sensitive details about their lives would be revealed and dissected in open court. As the case moved forward, pre-trial motions were filed. These often involved arguments over the admissibility of evidence such as the digital communications between Sarah and James Ellis or the extent to which details of their relationship could be presented to the jury. The defense argued that the provocative nature of the relationship was essential to understanding Thomas Harding's state of mind. The prosecution argued it established the motive for a planned murder.
These legal maneuvers were critical in shaping the narrative that would ultimately be presented at trial. The investigation continued to tie up loose ends. Interviews with anyone who might have had insight into Thomas Harding's state of mind in the days leading up to the shooting were conducted. His computer and phone records were thoroughly examined for any further evidence of planning or intent. While the core of the case seemed solid, prosecutors aimed to anticipate any potential defense arguments and strengthen their presentation of premeditation. The quiet life of Thomas Harding was now under a microscope. Every detail scrutinized for clues to the violence he had unleashed. The legal battle was set to begin, transforming the private tragedy into a public spectacle within the sterile walls of the courtroom. The quiet devastation of the parking lot had found its echo in the measured language of legal procedure, but the underlying human pain remained raw and profound. The next steps would take the case towards a confrontation where evidence would be presented, and a judgment rendered. The trial of Thomas Harding for the murders of Sarah Harding and James Ellis commenced several months later in the Chester County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed with media, members of the community, and those personally affected by the tragedy. Thomas Harding sat beside his defense attorneys, appearing composed, his face devoid of overt emotion, a stark contrast to the gravity of the proceedings. The prosecution opened their case by presenting a clear chronological narrative. They detailed the discovery of the bodies in the Northwood High School parking lot on the evening of November 14th. They presented the initial forensic findings, the shell casings, the bullet trajectories, the positions of the victims' bodies. An expert in ballistics testified, confirming definitively that the .45 caliber handgun found in Thomas Harding's truck was the weapon used to kill both Sarah Harding and James Ellis. The legally owned status of the weapon by Thomas Harding was presented as further evidence linking him directly to the crime. Security camera footage, showing Thomas Harding's truck arriving at the school parking lot minutes before the estimated time of the shooting, was played for the jury. Traffic camera images tracing his route from his home to the school corroborated his presence at the scene. This physical and digital evidence created a compelling timeline that placed Thomas Harding directly at the location and time of the murders with the murder weapon. The prosecution then moved to establish motive. They presented excerpts from Sarah Harding's phone, including the distressed message to her friend about her father discovering her relationship with Jay. They also presented portions of the text argument between Sarah and Thomas Harding from the days prior. Sarah's mother testified, recounting the heated argument between Sarah and Thomas Harding 2 nights before the shooting, confirming Thomas's anger upon learning of the relationship and his prohibition of Sarah seeing James Ellis. While the full details of the relationship between Sarah and James Ellis were handled delicately due to the sensitive nature and the age of Sarah, the prosecution presented sufficient evidence, primarily through communications found on their devices, to establish the existence of a sexual relationship and Thomas Harding's awareness of it. They argued this discovery was the clear catalyst for his actions, demonstrating premeditation and intent. They argued that Thomas Harding, upon learning of the relationship, deliberately armed himself, sought out Sarah and James Ellis at their prearranged meeting spot, and carried out the calculated killings. The defense did not dispute that Thomas Harding was the shooter or that his weapon was used. Their strategy centered on challenging the element of premeditation and arguing for a lesser charge such as voluntary manslaughter due to extreme emotional disturbance. They called witnesses, including a psychologist, who testified about the profound psychological impact that discovering such a betrayal could have on an individual, particularly a parent. They argued that Thomas Harding acted in a moment of extreme rage and emotional disturbance, that his actions, while horrific, were not the result of careful planning but a sudden violent response to an unbearable shock. The defense attempted to portray the discovery of the relationship as the trigger that sent Thomas Harding into a state of temporary madness, overwhelming his capacity for rational thought. They presented evidence of his previously unblemished record and his reputation as a quiet, law-abiding citizen to argue that this act was completely out of character, a deviation caused by an extraordinary emotional shock. They highlighted the ethically questionable nature of James Ellis's relationship with his student, suggesting this transgression contributed to the emotional turmoil that provoked Thomas Harding. During cross-examination, the prosecution challenged the notion of a spontaneous act. They reiterated the evidence of planning: Thomas Harding arming himself, driving to the specific location where Sarah and James Ellis were meeting, the multiple shots fired indicating deliberate action rather than a single impulsive act of rage. They argued that even if emotionally disturbed, his actions demonstrated intent to kill. The courtroom proceedings were marked by moments of intense emotional testimony, particularly from Sarah's mother, who had to recount the arguments and tensions in the home before the tragedy. Witness testimony from friends of Sarah highlighted her fear after her father's discovery. The clinical presentation of forensic evidence was juxtaposed with the raw human pain of loss and betrayal. The trial laid bare the hidden lives and the devastating consequences of their collision. The quiet composure of Thomas Harding throughout the proceedings remained a point of observation. Was it shock, remorse, or something else? The jury was tasked with navigating these complexities, weighing the evidence of intent against the arguments of emotional provocation. The fate of Thomas Harding, and the legal interpretation of that terrible evening in the parking lot, now rested in their hands. The trial was nearing its conclusion, moving towards the crucial stage of jury deliberation. As the trial reached its final stages, the prosecution and defense delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated their case for first-degree murder, emphasizing the evidence of premeditation: Thomas Harding acquiring his weapon, driving to the school parking lot, and the deliberate multiple shots fired at both victims. They argued that his actions were not a spontaneous outburst but a planned execution fueled by anger and a sense of violation. They reminded the jury of the devastating impact of his actions, ending 2 lives in a brutal act of violence. The defense countered by focusing on Thomas Harding's state of mind at the moment of the shooting. They argued that the discovery of his daughter's relationship with her teacher constituted a profound and unbearable emotional shock that overwhelmed his capacity for rational thought and planning. They urged the jury to consider the immense provocation and find him guilty of a lesser charge such as voluntary manslaughter, which acknowledges the killing occurred under circumstances of extreme emotional disturbance. They stressed that his previous character and lack of criminal history supported the argument that this was an aberration caused by an extraordinary event, not the act of a cold-blooded killer. They asked the jury to show mercy and understanding for a father driven to the edge by an agonizing revelation. The jury began deliberations. Their task was to weigh the evidence presented against the legal definitions of the charges. They had to decide if Thomas Harding's actions met the criteria for premeditated first-degree murder, or if the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the relationship reduced his culpability to a lesser degree. The process was lengthy, reflecting the complexity of the case and the human elements involved. The quiet deliberation room held the fate of Thomas Harding and the final legal interpretation of the tragedy. After several days, the jury reached a verdict. Thomas Harding was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury concluded that despite the emotional context, the evidence demonstrated a level of planning and intent that met the legal standard for premeditation. The act of arming himself, driving to the specific location, and the manner of the shooting were deemed indicative of deliberate action, rather than a crime of passion committed purely spontaneously without any forethought. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Thomas Harding remained stoic, showing no visible reaction. The families of the victims reacted with a mixture of grief and a sense of finality. Following the verdict, the sentencing phase began. In Pennsylvania, a conviction for first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without parole. Thomas Harding was formally sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, 1 for each murder. He was immediately remanded into custody to begin serving his sentence. The legal proceedings concluded with the sentencing, bringing a formal end to the criminal case. However, the human story and its lasting impact continued. Thomas Harding, the quiet accountant, would spend the rest of his life in prison, his ordinary existence replaced by the stark reality of incarceration. His act of violence, born out of a perceived betrayal and rage, had irrevocably destroyed multiple lives and shattered his own. The family of Sarah Harding was left to navigate a future without their daughter, forever grappling with the tragic circumstances of her death and the unimaginable reality of her father being her killer. Her mother carried the dual burden of grief for her child and the loss of her husband to the prison system. The complexity of their situation, the intertwining of victim and perpetrator within their own family unit, added layers of profound pain to their loss. The family of James Ellis also faced immense grief and the challenge of reconciling the man they knew with the revelations of his relationship with Sarah. His professional legacy was now overshadowed by the ethical breach that contributed to the tragedy. The Northwood High School community slowly began to heal, though the events left a lasting scar. The parking lot, once just a mundane transition space, became a permanent reminder of the violence that had occurred there. The quiet routines of school life continued, but beneath the surface, the memory of that Tuesday evening persisted. The story of Sarah Harding, James Ellis and Thomas Harding is a grim testament to the destructive power of hidden relationships, shattered trust and unchecked rage. It highlights how seemingly ordinary lives can conceal profound complexities, and how the collision of private secrets with public consequences can result in devastating, irreversible violence. The quiet of a suburban parking lot became the stage for a personal tragedy that rippled outward, leaving behind a legacy of loss, pain, and unanswered questions about the hidden depths of human nature, and the catastrophic consequences when trust and boundaries are violated, culminating in lethal fury. The finality of the verdict and sentence brought a close to the legal case, but the quiet devastation of that Tuesday evening in the Northwood High School parking lot lingered, a haunting reminder of the lives lost and the family shattered.